Have you ever dreamed of being an immortal dictator? Yeah, you have, don't lie to me. Well, if you've had these delusions of grandeur before, you've had plenty of time to fulfill them, because the Tropico series has been around since 2001. But today, we're going to be looking at Limbic Entertainment and Calypso Media's newest entry to the series, Tropico 6. Much like the games that came before it, Tropico 6 is about leading the remote island nation of Tropico, from its colonial oppressors to the unstable climate of the 20th century all the way to the modern day, while carefully balancing your internal politics, your foreign relations, and most importantly, making sure you get re-elected by whatever means necessary. It's a game that'll force you to think strategically as you try and juggle all of the assholes that constantly demand stuff from you and try to keep everyone happy so you can hold on to power for as long as possible. I guess it's a lot like being a real politician. I'd also like to point out that I haven't ever really played any of the Tropico games before. I only played the very small amount of Tropico 5, so I'm basically going into this series blind and fresh to its whole concept. So if you've never played any of the Tropico games either, then great, you probably won't berate me in the comments. Regardless, if you're a fan of city builders and can appreciate the humorous and satirical tone of the game, there's a lot to like about Tropico 6. Much of the gameplay in Tropico 6 is dictated by the various factions in your nation that you'll need to keep happy in order to ensure that you'll be re-elected, without having to legitimately alter the voting outcome, of course. The number of factions that you'll need to put up with will increase as you progress through the game's eras. The colonial era, the world wars era, the cold war era, and then the modern era, as each one unlocks new buildings and mechanics and gets progressively more complex. Your standing with the different factions will depend on multiple things, whether or not you accept their demands, what laws and edicts you enact, and even down to what buildings you build. So don't build too many wind turbines if you want to keep all the boomers happy. On top of that, you'll need to manage your foreign relations as well, which will also change and become more in number throughout the ages. Your standing with foreign superpowers will determine your trade pricing, your foreign aid income, and whether or not they will blockade or just straight up invade you. This is where Tropico starts to become far more complex and strategic than many other city builders. You've got to remember that you're not just a mayor, you're el presidente. You're in charge of a country, not just a city. You've got to keep all your factions in check, or if you displease them, keep them powerless and in the minority, lest they rise up against you. You've also got to make sure you keep Uncle Sam and Mr. Hitler happy unless you'd like to get nuked or blitzkrieged. Trying to keep everyone happy does limit your pure creative freedom a bit, which may be a bit of a turn-off for some people. And while their random demands did make each playthrough unique, it did mean that sometimes factions would demand a building from you that you'd already built the last 5 times they requested it. As someone who likes to put their feet up a bit when playing a city sim, Tropico does keep you a little more busy, especially when shit starts to go south. I did find it really engaging though, and a lot of fun to manage all of your internal and external politics. And there's no saying you need to be any specific kind of dictator either. You can be a fully democratic republic or a totalitarian police state with plenty of different policies and edicts you can enact as well, which really embellishes this game's replayability. The other main focus of this game is obviously your economy, and more importantly the goods you have available for export. You'll need to have a variety of trade goods or you will very quickly run out of money. As you move through the eras, new industry buildings were available as well as other forms of income such as tourism or new policies that you could enact. And if you didn't make the most of the new advancements, your economy would suffer. Coming back to the strategic aspects of the game, building placement, and in particular housing placement, was very important in ensuring that your economy ran efficiently. If workers took ages to get where they worked or if goods couldn't be transported effectively, it would really hurt your income. Your economy would always go to total shit whenever you advanced to the next stage. It kinda made me reluctant to advance further once my economy was booming again, but it also kinda made sense for things to go a little pear-shaped as you stepped into a new period of history. As previously mentioned, more political factions will show up once you advance in age as well, which makes your internal politics a little more unstable. So while advancing in age may give you access to new stuff, it was always a trade-off for that period of instability. One thing I noticed about this game was that every time I started a new playthrough, I felt like I was genuinely getting better at it, rather than just building another city on a new island, which goes a long way to show the level of depth that this game has. The raid mechanic was pretty interesting, though it just sort of allowed you to get extra bonuses for free. Stealing wonders was cool and all, but they all felt kind of OP. Maybe just pure big dick energy was enough reward for stealing national landmarks, not that they had to eradicate poverty and shit too. There was also no real trade-off for it either. It just felt like they threw the mechanic on top of the game in order to just give you a bonus with no recourse, which is odd considering how much of the rest of the game works is finding a balance between making someone happy at the cost of making someone else mad. I enjoyed the broker and Swiss bank account mechanic, however. It didn't offer a massive amount gameplay-wise other than a few cheeky unlocks and bonuses, but it definitely fit the theme of the game well and often required you to meet certain demands, so it at least had some form of trade-off. The combat in this game was a little bit lame. Fights and uprisings just kinda played out automatically and were usually fairly inconsequential. I tried to avoid conflict not out of necessity, but because it was one of the less interesting mechanics in the game. The game mode I played the most of was the sandbox mode, which was as it sounds, a sandbox version of the game where you will just play through all the different eras, from either a pre-generated map or a randomly generated one. I'd be inclined to say that this is the most commonly played game mode. However, there were also missions, which were almost like a story mode or short campaigns of sorts that were dictated by specific unique events. They were pretty fun and they all had nicely made maps for them as well. And to be honest, I found that they helped you get a deeper understanding of a lot of the game's mechanics. The game did also have a useful set of tutorials, so it was pretty easy for someone totally new to the game like me to get into it without a lot of trouble. The game also has a multiplayer mode which I haven't really explored as of yet due to the fact that I have nobody to play with, and from what I can tell it's a little unstable at the moment. If they manage to get it running smoothly, I'm sure it'd be a very interesting experience. In all honesty, I think that the game could use a little more late game content, because once I hit the modern era and had stabilized my economy, there wasn't a whole lot more to do other than a bit of good old fashioned urban sprawl. From what I can tell from the Tropico 5 DLC lineup, we're likely to see it expanded upon in the future, albeit with a price tag. One thing I didn't particularly like was the random map generation. I very much like to be able to play on a randomly generated map, as it definitely adds to the replayability and uniqueness of each playthrough, but none of the generated maps were really that great, and were especially overshadowed by the pre-made maps used in missions. The generated maps were often very square and plain, lacking features like streams and rivers or more detailed coastlines, which I thought was quite disappointing. I get that a generated map will realistically never be as cool as a handmade one, but the algorithm could have been at least a little more creative. There were a bunch of pre-made maps to play on in sandbox mode however, as well as all of the mission maps, so that kinda made up for it. Visually, the game is pretty good, as long as you don't zoom too far in. But I think that's pretty standard for a city builder, as it doesn't matter so much when you spend the vast majority of your time zoomed out quite far. Some of the animations and stuff are a little bit janky, but again, normally you wouldn't notice that when you're hovering a few hundred feet above your city like the perpetual dictator that you are. There were also a few little graphical glitches, but not many, and they were really nothing deal-breaking. What I did enjoy visually was the art style, particularly that of the character portraits. They were all a little comical and exaggerated, which certainly fit with the tone of the game and only enhanced each of the characters and factions you interacted with. Honestly, the characters were great. Penultimo is my boy. The game also gives you the option to customize both your palace and your presidente as well, which is all purely cosmetic other than the trait you choose, which has a minor gameplay effect, but was a nice feature nonetheless. The UI was pretty good, nice and polished visually, and wasn't too hard to wrap my head around. Some parts like the raid screen were a little bit unintuitive, and pause by default was P. I mean, like, come on, it's 2019. The pause-unpause button is spacebar, okay? Don't make me have to rebind that shit. I found the almanac very useful, especially when it came to be monitoring my unemployment and homelessness issues that were constantly rampant throughout my playthroughs. The game in general does a good job at telling you when there's an issue, but not specifically telling you how to fix it, which causes you to think a little more critically and really improves on the gameplay and strategy. I quite enjoyed the music. It's not exactly the sort of thing I'd listen to on a Spotify playlist, but hey, it was fun and it fit the theme of the game well, considering we're meant to be on a Caribbean island. The writing is good too, humorous throughout. This game doesn't take itself too seriously. It did get a little bit repetitive, but the voice acting was really good, which really made the characters as good as they are. Even just the little touches, like Penultimo changing outfits for different raid missions, it all came together really nicely. Overall, the game fits its dictatorial, political, and slightly ridiculous tone brilliantly. Along with the visuals and gameplay, Limbic Entertainment have done a great job at making you feel like you're in the domain of a badass Caribbean dictator. Throughout my time spent in Tropico 6, I had a lot of fun. I thoroughly enjoyed playing political hardball on my little island paradise while stumbling my way through economic management and city layout until I was somewhat competent at it. There's certainly a lot more strategy to this game than there is to many other city builder sims, as it adds a whole new layer to the game with its political dealings, and while it did restrict you a little bit creatively, it did add a lot to its depth and replayability. The general consensus seems to be that Tropico 4 is the best game in the series, at least prior to the release of Tropico 6, but to that I couldn't really tell you because I've never played Tropico 4, so please don't yell at me about that. Regardless, as a newcomer to the series, I was very much impressed by this game. Although I often like to sit back in my city sims and it didn't let me do that quite as much, the complexity and strategy of this game had me hooked. Its ridiculous and satirical nature was entertaining, and the way that it tied into the gameplay was great as well. The game's still lacking a bit of late game flavor and maybe some of the mechanics could be revised or a little less overpowered, but there is a lot of replayability and a lot to like about this game. And if you're a fan of city builders, I would definitely recommend it, so long as you can cop the price tag. So the next time you're feeling down about not being able to start a communist authoritarian regime in a remote backwater island in the Caribbean, it might be time for you to have a bash at Tropico.